Good morning. Welcome to our second Sunday forum of the year. You can sit up here in these chairs or at the tables if you have food, wherever you're comfortable. So today is our second in our series as we lead up all the way up until right before Palm Sunday with a series related to pilgrimage and lots of different iterations of that. And so today we are happy to welcome for the first time to St. Stephen's, James Strange, who is a professor in the Biblical and Religious Studies department at Samford, of whom we've hosted a number of his colleagues, and so we're happy to add him to that group. And so James's expertise is in archaeology, biblical archaeology, and so he's going to share the intersection of that with our theme of pilgrimage today. So thanks for being with us, James.
Thank you very much, Becky, and thank you for having me. By the way, I'm used to Baptists sitting on the back row, but maybe if I hang out with enough Episcopalians, I'll see that it's a universal behavior. I'm very pleased to be talking about this. It's actually a terribly interesting topic, and it's one that I think about a little bit. In archaeology, I've been thinking somewhat about refugee movements because of the war that destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in 70, and asking where people went after that, if they went anywhere. And then a second war in 135 and the forced removal of Jews from Judea. And I asked questions about, can we detect them archaeologically? Now I'm thinking about things a little bit differently, about pilgrimage, which is a very different kind of migration and usually temporary. So I have some images on the board to help us think about that. There's Herod's temple on the left-hand side. We'll say a little bit about that momentarily. Of course, that's a photograph of a model. It's a great big model, but it is still a model. Oops, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stay there. The second one is a photograph taken by one of our student excavators at the site where we excavate. She's holding a caper flower, and we'll see that photograph in a minute. And then next is a chapel at a pilgrim site, a combination archaeological and pilgrim site in Magdala that we'll talk about a little bit. And we won't actually talk about the one on the right, on the far right, very much, only because my main topic is Christian pilgrimage. But of course, there are pilgrims from all over the globe who come to Jerusalem to see the Dome of the Rock and to enter it and to pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque next door. All right, so let's get straight to it, as they say on YouTube. Here's the outline of what I'd like to do today. I want to begin by talking just a little bit about pilgrimage in Jesus' day, pilgrimage to Jerusalem from other parts, first of all, of the Holy Land, and second of all, other parts of the Roman world. And then I want to talk about the archaeology of pilgrimage. Can we detect pilgrimage to Jerusalem archaeologically? Third, I want to talk about archaeologists themselves as pilgrims. This is really sort of differentiating those of us who excavate as our research, with our research questions and methods, and those upon whose labor we rely to get the work done. Folks like you who want to come to Israel and experience Israel and dig and do other things. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I want to talk just briefly about Christian pilgrimage in the Byzantine era, and finally Holy Land archaeology and pilgrimage today. That's a lot to get done in the time we have remaining, so let's start sprinting. Let's begin with pilgrimage in Jesus' day. Here's that model of the temple that I told you about. I just want you to see it. I'll say a couple of things about it. Herod starts building this thing. There's a great discussion about whether or not he demolishes the existing temple, which is called the Second Temple, built between 520 and 515 BC by the returners from Babylon who've been in exile. Herod decides to do this. We don't know if he demolishes the existing temple or if he beautifies it. We do know that he expands that platform on top. He doubles it in size. So not too many of us think in terms of acres, so I'm going to talk in terms of football fields. That thing is 27 football fields in area. And it's the same area today as the platform on which the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque sit. He beautifies it tremendously. So it is unrecognizable, I think, by the time he gets done. And it is a site for pilgrimage. Now, we get told about this in New Testament texts, not only New Testament texts, we get told about it in other texts, but I figure these are the ones you'd be the most familiar with. So we have mentions in the Gospel of Luke that make it sound as if Jesus' family regularly goes there. That is, when they accidentally leave him there. That's not the first time they've been there. And we have other texts that talk about Jesus going as an adult, as a practice that many other people are engaging in. And of course, the famous story at the beginning of the book of Acts is the next major festival after Passover, which is Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, another pilgrim festival, and there's a third one. So there are three major pilgrimage festivals. There was a time at which scholars just said, this is overwrought, this is exaggeration. People did not go to Jerusalem, certainly not peasants from the Galilee. They didn't go there nearly so often as the biblical story suggests that they do, because of the expense involved and all that kind of stuff. They're all reasonable objections, but this kind of stuff is the kind of thing that gets archaeologists excited because we start asking, well, can we find any evidence of this practice or not? And how would we know that we're seeing evidence of this practice? So, let's talk about the archaeology of pilgrimage. Pardon me, I'm going to cough. It's going to be loud. All right, so what you're looking at is a particular type of oil lamp. It's called a Herodian lamp because it's made while the Herods are ruling the area. These two come from our archaeological site called Shechin. Now, I'll just tell you a couple of things about this kind of lamp. First of all, everybody knows how to make it. Whether you're Jew or you're a non-Jew, when we come excavate the town you used to live in, back there in the Roman period, we're going to find it. We're going to find a whole bunch of them. We know how they're made. They're thrown on a wheel with that nozzle stuck on afterwards, and then the edges paired. You can probably see that a little bit more clearly here, the knife pairing along the edges. So that's where it gets that part of its name. So everybody knows how to make it. So a guy named David Adon Beowitz, who was a professor at Bar Ilan University in Israel, said, you know what I'm going to do? And everybody said, what? And he said, I'm going to do neutron activation analysis. He'd actually been doing a lot of it. And I'm going to look at, first of all, clays from the Jerusalem area. And then I'm going to get samples of this kind of lamp from a bunch of different sites up north in the Galilee, sites that have largely non-Jewish populations and those that have largely Jewish populations, and I'm going to try to figure out where the clay comes from that these lamps are made out of. And guess what he found? You'll never guess, so I'll tell you. He found out that, first of all, like I said, everybody knows how to make the lamps, and they all make them locally. So they all have their own local clays, and they know how to make the lamps out of their local clays. So they have potters who can make the lamp. At villages or cities, really, with largely non-Jewish populations, less than 50%, 40 some odd percent of the lamps, or 35%, were made in Jerusalem, and the rest were made locally. Go to a city or a village with a Jewish population or a completely Jewish population, north of 80% are made in Jerusalem. So at the city of Sepphoris, for example, about 85% of the lamps were made in Jerusalem. Well, the clay comes from Jerusalem, I should say that. A little village, more than 90%, the clay comes from Jerusalem. Now, that's a remainder of the hypothesis to be tested. How is the clay getting up there? Is it getting up to the north as a lamp or as clay and then being made into a lamp there? Now, these guys, they thought it was probably more reasonable that it was coming up as a lamp. It's much lighter as a lamp than it is as wet clay. So the authors of this study talked about preferential distribution. That was their scholarly and careful term. But they did speculate right at the end of that article about this being a sign of pilgrimage, that people in the north, both in villages and in cities, were making pilgrimage to Jerusalem. How often, we can't tell, but they're bringing back these lamps from Jerusalem. And that allows all sorts of speculation about the meaning of the object itself. You and I can think about light meaningfully, and certainly biblical authors do. Well, a lamp from Jerusalem associated with the temple, where the menorah, the seven-branched lampstand, is burning eternally, is the ideal. Probably, if we're right about this is probably an act that is thick with meaning. So that when Jesus says they don't light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket, he's not simply talking about let your light so shine and so people can see your good deeds. Certainly that's there, but that idea carries with it the weight of this notion of bringing the light from Jerusalem. Anyway, that's the kind of thing you can't check because you can't interview these people anymore. But we do speculate about it. So that's just a little bit about the archaeology of pilgrimage. Now let's talk about archaeologists as pilgrims. So here is our 2022 crew. We were an interesting crew this year, one of the largest crews we've had, and we had people from 6 different countries this year, so we were more international than in years past. We're always a little bit international. Most of us are Americans, but we always have Israelis digging with us. There's always a pastor from France who comes and digs with us, and we get folks, we have a Polish student with us this year and people from China, so we had a pretty good spread of folks. This is just a small group of folks in one archaeological square, but let me tell you about our typical archaeological volunteers. Most of them are undergraduate, that we get more of those than other folks, more undergraduates and retired empty nesters, which makes sense. Those people have the time to come and dig. But we do get folks who are middle-aged, fewer of them. They typically, if they are middle-aged, they're like me, although I'm just about to be officially old. I'm 59. Am I officially old yet? Okay. Next year? No, really? Middle age, how long does middle age stretch now? 75. When I hit 75, I'll be old. Okay. So people are like me. They're middle-aged, and that means usually they're professors of some type. Education, as you can guess, most folks are pretty well educated. Some college usually refers to those who are in the middle of their undergraduate program. A lot of folks have advanced degrees in various fields. And our devotion runs all the way from devout to agnostic or atheist. Most people who come are somewhere on the line closer to devout, often Christian. But we do get a lot of Jewish folks, and we've had one Muslim student from the U.S. And our race, now in America we think of race or ethnicity in terms of whiteness or blackness or Hispanic, something like that. In Israel they think about it as Jewish or Muslim or Christian. Those are ethnic designations more than they are religious practice designations, although sometimes they overlap significantly. So a lot of diversity, although most are white American Christians. And those of us who operate archaeological field schools in Israel think something along these lines. We've got to collect some data. So we need to excavate scientifically or stratigraphically so that we can get the information that we want. We can't just dig holes. We've got to do it scientifically. We do want to teach American excavation and recording methods to raise up more of ourselves. This is how we clone ourselves to get more archaeology done in the region. And of course, we want to publish. We want to get the information out there. So that's why, this is what I was thinking about when I set up a field school. Why would you come to dig? My guess is none of your motivations would match a single one of those. Even if you're interested in archaeology, you probably wouldn't say, well, you know, I'd like to learn how to dig stratigraphically. You'd say, can I find that gold head that Indiana Jones found at the beginning of the movie without having to run from the big, ball that's going to crush me? Most folks who come to dig, by the way, a former Samford colleague, a sociologist, helped me dope this out, say that they want to walk where Jesus walked. So the archaeology piece is not nearly so important to them as is this piece of personal motivation, faith. Right? There's something about having the soles of my feet in the land, treading where Jesus walked, seeing the landscapes that he saw. If they're Jewish, they want to learn about their Jewish heritage. which they can do by excavating at our site. A lot of them want to experience Israeli culture, and they just absolutely love the food. They're having a fantastic time, this cross-cultural experience. And of course, this idea of getting away from the familiar. That's our way of saying a sense of adventure. Coming on an 4-week archaeological dig, it's a bit of an adventure. And guess what we found out? We found out that if those were their motivations, especially the last one, it helped them or we could predict that they would find the archaeology to be a very important part of their experience. We used to say, don't come here if all you want is an adventure. Go have an adventure. Come here if you want to be a scientist. And we found out we were wrong about that. To get good archaeology done in the field, it helps if your people have this sense of adventure. So I say, if they come for this, and this, and this, we can predict that this will be important to them. And this is setting up shade, by the way, at the beginning of the dig so we don't get so much dehydration. And this is surveying. You're looking at 3 folks from Alabama, by the way. The guy on the right is the expert in surveying, and the 2 on the left are students. The one in the middle is now getting ready to finish her Ph.D. at Oxford University, and the one on the left is now a pharmacist, a local pharmacist. And here's that photo I told you about. So this is one of our Samford students. This is from our site, overlooking the Beit Natofa Valley, and she's holding a caper blossom in her hand and photographing the valley and the sun setting to the west. This is after we came out to take final photographs, and she took advantage of the gorgeous sunset. We are actually waiting for the sun to get down low because we don't want shadows on our squares. All right, let's talk about Christian pilgrimage in the Byzantine era. This we can start detecting archaeologically because once they can build churches, they start building churches, starting in the 4th century, and they start writing about it. So when we read their pilgrim accounts, when we go up north and look in their pilgrim accounts, here's what we see. They go to the village of Nain. As you recall, in Luke, Jesus raises a dead young man there from his funeral bier. He's being taken to the tomb. Then they go to Mount Tabor, and sure enough, there is a very nice Byzantine church on top of Mount Tabor. They want to go to Nazareth and visit the church there. Many sites, the sites were more than one site where the angel Gabriel announced to Mary that she would give birth to Jesus, and you can go see a lot of those sites today. Kafr Kana, they're told, is the site of Cana of the Galilee. There's an alternative site that some of them mention. We call it Khibet Kana, which means the ruin of Cana. There are Roman period remains at both places, and Pilgrim remains at both places. And then they get to the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Often they go to Tiberias, and then they come around to Migdal or Tarikiai, we'll call it Magdala, Heptapagon or 7 Springs. Has anybody here been to Israel? Did you go to Tabqa, the Church of the Loaves and Fishes? That's what in Arabic it comes out as Tabqa. Capernaum, you probably went there. A site being excavated now is Bethsaida Julius, usually Hippos Susita, and sometimes they get all the way up to Caesarea Philippi, which is actually off the map to the north. So we can track their pilgrim routes. Now I want to talk about Magdala here, or Migdal. Migdal is Hebrew for tower. Magdala is Aramaic for the tower. So here it is in the 19th century. There's Tiberias. Go up to El Mejdel, and you can tell that Arabic name of that town preserves the Hebrew and Aramaic, Migdal or Magdala. But by the time it's being surveyed in the late 19th century, there's no longer a church there. Those little symbols are for mosques. That's a symbol for a mosque there and there. There is a little church down here, the Lutheran, or the Latin Covenant, down in Tiberias. So here's what's interesting about Magdala. First of all, three guys who are locals don't know anything about a pilgrim site there. At least they don't mention it. Eusebius talks about all of these biblical sites that he can find and doesn't mention Magdala. Jerome doesn't mention it. He's working with Eusebius's text. Egeria comes through in 381, and the Piacenza Pilgrim also don't mention Magdala. So we're all the way up to the 6th century. Finally, Theodosius, who's in Israel sometime in that period, mentions Magdala and that Mary was born there, but he doesn't mention any kind of church or monastery or anything like that. Epiphanius, the monk, comes through in the 7th to 8th centuries, late 7th, early 8th centuries, and he mentions a church over the house of the Magdalene, but no town. Willibald, the German monk, comes through, or bishop actually, comes through in 724 to 726 and mentions the town, but no church. It's not making a huge impression on pilgrims. So let's talk about Holy Land archaeology and pilgrimage today. In the 1970s, the Franciscans who owned the property of Magdala, so where that village of El Mejdel had sat until 1948, started excavating. And they excavated the site down here in this part. I'm simply showing you the area of their excavations and found a very impressive Roman and then later Byzantine settlement, actually Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine. And look at that great, big, huge monastery that they found. That was kind of impressive. 6th century monastery. It doesn't show up in this part here. I just show you this bit, which is that bit, just so you can see the rigorous construction that's going on during the Roman period. So they find a town that's built on a Hellenistic and then a Roman orthogonal grid, rather than more organically that we see a lot of villages being built in. And they find a lot of the kinds of buildings that we expect in Hellenistic and Roman period towns. And now I'm going to talk about this region up here, especially that bit right there. In the 2000s, a different branch of the Catholic Church, the Legionaries of Christ, wanted to build a pilgrim center in the land that they owned at the site of Magdala. So they began with a backhoe very carefully scraping to see if they're going to encounter any archaeological remains, and they found that stone. And you've probably read about it in the news and maybe seen photographs of it now, called the Magdala stone. I don't have time to say much about it. I'll point out the menorah that's on it. The synagogue in which it sat, so here's the excavated remains here, and there's the stone. Oh, I can do this. I actually drew arrows to it. So if we're correct, that's the placement of the stone in the synagogue. And that means that a synagogue that was dismantled around the year 68, before the Romans came and defeated Magdala in a sea battle, that means that this synagogue was there before the destruction of Jerusalem, and it featured a menorah associated with the temple during Jesus' day. That's another way of connecting the religion of the north with the religion of the south, and connecting synagogue worship with temple worship, even though the practices won't be identical. Right? No sacrifice happening in a synagogue. Well, these guys began digging like mad. Most of that order, or much of that order, is from Mexico. So they had Mexican archaeologists, and they had teams from Mexico and the U.S. and Europe and Israel, local Israelis coming to dig, and they dug year-round for 3 years and dug madly and uncovered this synagogue. Here's a sketch of what it looked like. I'll now show you a reconstruction by a guy named Rittmeyer. A couple of corrections. I don't know why he made the exterior walls look like candy, but they would not have been multicolored. They probably would have been plastered white, and the reader is probably facing the opposite direction. If he's facing north in this picture, it should be facing south, in my humble opinion. Well, here's what I want to show you. So here's what they wanted. This is what they were aiming at when they started digging. And now they've taken into account the archaeological remains. So archaeologists regularly take their groups of archaeological students, that is local Israeli, professors in Israeli universities bring their students there, and we foreigners bring our students there to see the remains. And I walk my group around here and lecture in this area, down in that area, and in this area. The synagogue is under this building now. And when we first started going, we had to enter through the old office and gift shop and snack shop where they sold really good cappuccinos and ice cream. And now here's the hotel and guest house where we just stayed with a group that I took in January, beginning of January. And here's a restaurant that's currently under construction, and here is what they call Duke in Altum. I'll talk about that in just a second, their worship center. That's the first thing they built, was the worship center. So they started bringing people in who wanted to come to Israel for pilgrimage. They started this worship center for them first before building anything else. So for the rest of the time, I'm going to talk about this area and how this branch, this order of the Catholic Church is thinking about pilgrimage and archaeology and thinking about the opportunity to have Jewish-Christian dialogue in Israel. So, the Franciscan property, by the way, the Franciscans, they have all that wonderful stuff and they don't open it up for tours. I don't know why. They do it at Capernaum, but they don't do it at Magdala. All right, so I'm going to use photographs from their website. These are screen snips, so you can see how they're using photographs of not only the archaeology, but also what they've constructed in order to attract pilgrims to the area. And it's gorgeous photography, and it's a gorgeous area, gorgeous construction. So this is from the back part of the property, looking with the rooms on either side, looking toward the main lobby. Here's what the synagogue looks like now. So they built this wooden structure over it, and it's right next to this is the lobby area here. So you can go sit down, have a cappuccino from the bar here, and overlook the synagogue. There's a replica of the stone. The original stone's actually inside under glass. There's another replica over our left shoulder. We'll come back and take a look at some interior parts of this synagogue. I'll just mention a couple of things here. So there's a sunken area here with benches, stone benches surrounding it. And then there are benches along the outside walls. Those are the benches I want you to look at. And then there is a mosaic up here that I'll show you in just a second. Here is their Duke in Altum worship center from the outside. Duke in Altum is the Latin from the Vulgate for launch into the deep, with Jesus telling the disciples, go throw your nets out there for a big catch of fish. If we enter into the atrium, this is what it looks like, with, as you can imagine, astounding acoustics. We're looking toward the chapel, the main chapel. There's several chapels. So you can see what looks like a boat in there. That's actually the altar. And of course, the mast and the boom form a cross. They're taking advantage of water. So the podium here is made out of a green marble. This outside is a pool of water that actually stretches all the way around the worship space, and they typically have the windows open so that you can hear the sound of water during your service, during Mass. But they also want it to be so that if you're sitting in the pews and you look out, you see that water, and it's supposed to, depending on the height of the Sea of Galilee, it's supposed to blend with the Sea of Galilee. So it's as if you are there on the water or in a boat on the water of the Sea of Galilee. There are icons of all of the apostles around the sides, which I'm not showing you. Here it is from the other side. So this was something sent to a priest there who posted it for our group to see. But that's what it looks like from the outside looking in. Let's go back to that synagogue. I want to show you, first of all, the meander pattern that's reproduced in the floor. It's hard to tell. You'll see it better in just a second. There's the replica of the stone. And here, well, those are not the benches. I really want you to see those benches, but I don't have a good photograph of them. But I also want you to see this red that's reproduced in the Duke in Altum and the Encounter Chapel. They sent off samples to a firm in Germany to get that red reproduced for them. So here is the Encounter Chapel. with this mural that I'm going to show you in just a minute. But the stone, they've done a couple of things with this chapel. They've done their best to reproduce in some ways what it's like to be in the synagogue, what they think it was like to be in that Magdala synagogue. So they built benches to resemble the synagogue benches, and they're just as uncomfortable as those benches in the synagogue must have been. They do have cushions on them, which probably they had in the synagogue as well, by the way. The stone pavement resembles the first century Roman stone pavement outside the church. And what I'm not showing you are walls on the left and right painted the same red as a synagogue fresco, and the interior columns. There are interior columns so that you have a similar experience. I'll talk just a little bit now about this fresco, which is I'm not fresco, but a mural, a detail of the miracle of the healing of the woman with the hemorrhage. And the artist wanted to capture the moment of healing. Interpreting the language in Luke and Matthew as this idea of the fringe, the tzitzit, that are worn by, we know, probably Jewish males, maybe Jewish females as well, this fringe that's mentioned. So that's why we see feet and not touching the shoulder, but we're talking about a reach down, way down below. Here is what one of the local priests does. His name is Father Kelly. When a group is there, he'll ask somebody if there's somebody that they're praying for healing for, a loved one or something like that, and have them come up. And he'll take their camera and he'll ask them to position their hand like this and then take a photograph while he's intoning a prayer for them to say back to him, repeat after me. And it's a prayer for healing. And then, of course, the person has this on their phone. This is my cousin, by the way, who came on the trip. Her name is Nancy Allen. Oh, she's down at the bottom. Nancy. I knew her as Nancy Dawn in Midland, Texas, but she now goes by Nancy. So that's part of this pilgrim experience that this Catholic order, the Legionaries of Christ, are hoping for people to have. I'll tell you just a brief story. This is not a great photo because it's a screenshot of a video, but our group from Shades Crest Baptist Church was inside the chapel with Father Kelly, and there was a small group, maybe 3 German Catholic pilgrims in there getting ready to start a prayer service. And so he, speaking to them in German, said, I've got these American Alabamian Baptists, and they want to know about this chapel. Do you mind if I lecture about the chapel? And then when the rest of your group gets here, then we'll leave. They said, fine. So he lectured, and then they came in. But their priest was leading them. He came in immediately, knelt on his kneeling bench, and they came in procession. I mean, they were singing a German hymn already. And, of course, we knew the tune, so some of us joined in, singing English. And once they sat down, they were in the middle of their prayer service, interspersing song with prayer. And we were about the same size. We were about 20. They were probably about 30. And we just didn't feel comfortable getting up and leaving. And furthermore, we were now praying and singing with them. And you can't tell, right here is a woman with a guitar. And she's the one singing. And they sing through the first song. It's a simple tune, so even though most of us don't know the German, we can sing the tune after 2 times through. So we're humming along, and then she switched to English, and we all immediately knew what she had done. So they were inviting us to sing with them, so we did. And then when they moved to the next verse, they would do it in German, then switch to English. And then she just started calling out verses in English. And we would switch to those English verses. And that happened for every song. There were about 3 songs. 3 songs in total. And we sang all of them. And it was a very moving experience for us and for them. And they welcomed us into their prayer service. By the way, the priest, not this priest, but the priest of the Duc in Altum, was gesturing frantically to my pastor, trying to tell him, you can leave any time you want. And my pastor was going, we're not leaving. We're staying. And it was truly wonderful. So here is Dr. Katharina Westerhostmann. Turns out she teaches American students in Austria. She's the tall one in the middle with the glasses here. And there's my pastor, Nick Seaborn, on the left. Here's the synagogue mosaic meander. There it is. And here are the interior columns like the synagogue, and here is the red of the synagogue fresco. So we're standing in a place where a bunch of Catholics are trying to, in some ways, reproduce the experience of being in a synagogue in the first century of Jesus' day at the town of Magdala, and at least one of them emphasizing this miracle of grace done for this woman who had had a hemorrhage for so long. And here we are as modern pilgrims encountering others like us and different from us and worshiping together at an archaeological site. And having actually one of the highlights of our time in Israel near the beginning. So, we'll probably do this again. Here we are on the Mount of Olives with the Al-Aqsa Mosque to the left and the Dome of the Rock central. Well, that's all I have, and I'm happy to take your questions. I think we have time for just a few.
Yeah. If you have questions or comments for James, let me bring you the mic so people online and in the room can hear. So.
Thank you for the presentation.
You're
That
welcome.
was wonderful. I'm curious, you mentioned you have a site. What's the permitting like? Who controls the site when you're not there? Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. The state of Israel issues excavation permits, and so I have to apply every year. And everything that we excavate belongs to the state of Israel. So it's all in storage in Israel until I publish it, and then it goes into storage. They're in charge of storage. I'll send it all to them. No one is supposed to be able to get into the site while we're gone. And there's a fence around it with barbed wire and signs saying, "Danger, stay out." And of course, people go in all the time because it's in the middle of agricultural fields. So there's really nobody there. There are some locals who kind of keep an eye on it, but there are a lot of mountain bikers who ride by it all the time, so they know it's there. So we get visitors while we're there and visitors while we're not there.
I can't remember her name, but there's a professor at UAB that uses satellites to uncover archaeological sites.
Sarah Parkak.
Yeah, thank you very much. Has she done that kind of work in and around Israel to find some of these, 2,000, 3,000-year-old sites?
She hasn't done it in Israel. She's mostly working in Egypt. But other folks have done some of that work. Typically, the sites are known, and something like LIDAR or some other remote sensing shows up stuff that can't be seen by the eye. So you get a whole lot more information suddenly. Even just satellite photography sometimes does it.
How did you find this site?
Well, it's sometimes you don't need anything special. You can just walk the site and you see scatters of pottery, and you know that there's going to be a site there. So that site was identified back in the 1980s by a survey.
What else are you all wondering about this morning?
Anybody want to come dig now? Okay. Give me a ring.
How long is the dig when you go?
The dig lasts for 4 weeks. 4 weeks. Yeah. But I accept people for 4, 3, and 2 weeks because not too many people can spend 4 weeks digging.
How physical is it? I'm 76.
It's physical labor digging outside for 8 hours a day, but people who are 76 regularly come and regularly do just fine. Yeah. Young folks tend to work themselves to exhaustion. People who are 76 hardly ever do. They're just too smart, They'll work steadily all day long, where the young bucks get out there and swing a pick for 30 minutes and then they're done.
And how much training do you have to have before you start to dig?
No training is necessary. before digging. We'll give you all the training you need. We consider ourselves to be an archaeological field school, so we give you all training in the excavation and the recording methods, and a certificate when you're done.
So you see these movies with brushes, and they're just brushing, and they're not really digging. Is that part of what they do?
Sometimes we do excavate with brushes, yes. Yeah. Especially at a site like Shechin, where the remains are so close to the surface, you can't dig with anything big for very long, because then you'll start destroying what's beneath. So then you got to switch to brushes.
Tell us about what other places have you done excavations? I mean, it sounds like you spent a lot of time in this place. Are there other places that you've spent time doing this? Or?
2 other places, really, that I got most of my experience before this at a city site called Sepphoris, which is in the middle of Galilee, and actually not very far from our site. We can see it. And then a couple of weeks at a site down in, not too far from Jerusalem, called Gezer, dug there, nope, sorry, wrong site, Mikne, Tel Mikne, dug there for about 2 weeks back in 1994, and 1 day at a site in the Negev desert, about the same year. Lots of scorpions at that site.
All right, last call for questions.
Yeah, none of those, not yet. Yes, ma'am, you had a question.
Oh, hold on, Virginia.
Most exciting finds? You know, if you talk to volunteers, they'll probably say it's whatever they found. You know, because first of all, you can't dig in Israel without finding something. You're just going to find lots of material culture. So there's something about realizing that you're holding in your hand a bit of material culture. That's our fancy way of saying an object that hasn't seen the light of day for 1,600 years. You can sometimes get chills. Even a 59-year-old seasoned archaeologist can sometimes get chills doing that. So it's whatever that thing is. For me, it's discovering that the site of Shechin had an oil lamp industry, which nobody knew about and we did not expect to find. And to suddenly realize, oh, this little bitty village is probably important for the local economy and the distribution of oil lamps like the ones that I showed you earlier.
All right. Thank you so much, James, for sharing.
Thank you very
all
much
that.
for having
Thank
me.
you.